Good evening, everyone. I'm very glad that you have come here and that you have made it. Is this loud enough? Very glad that you're here. Is it too loud, Sally, for your tender ears? I'm very glad that you've made it here safely through the snow and appreciate your effort in getting here. This is the second week of our series of Just Conversations. This series, listening to our brothers and sisters in faith from other traditions. And we are, as the book implies, trying to welcome the wisdom of the world. As I mentioned last week, the goal here is not so much a comprehensive academic understanding of other world religions, so as it is to hear what other faith traditions have to say about just some sort of the basic human questions of life. And so we will certainly learn something, although not everything, about the intricacies and details about Buddhism, but we will learn some great reflections from somebody in that tradition about the kind of questions that Joan Chittister raises. And what we'll do is Jack will introduce Buddhism in sort of a background tradition history way, and then he's going to address the questions in the book. And as we did last week, I will ask a question or make a response as each one of those questions unfold, and then we'll leave a significant amount of time at the end for your own questions as well. So we'll try to get everybody out of here by 8 o'clock again, and if we go a little... Oh, and at the end we're going to have a time of, would you call it meditation? A time of led meditation in the Buddhist tradition. So, does that sound okay? Yeah. Okay, great. So, without further ado, Andy, who is supposed to be doing this introduction, is sick, and so can't be here. And I don't have his biographical information, so I'm just going to introduce Jack Hatfield and say we're very glad that you are here. Welcome. And we look forward to hearing you. But he'll introduce a little bit more about himself up front. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It will be in a moment. All right.
Someone asked me, well, Mike asked me before, how long you've been a Buddhist? And I answered 42 years. One of the problems is a lot of people that do Buddhist things don't call themselves Buddhist. That there's a magazine called Tricycle, which is addresses a lot of different areas of Buddhism. It's the most popular, and it's a very fancy thing. And they did a survey and found that only half of the subscribers call themselves Buddhist. And part of the reason is that it's not exclusive. You can be a Christian Buddhist, you can be a Jewish Buddhist, you can be an Islamic Buddhist, and people like myself don't like to exclude something. So if I would call myself a Buddhist, I don't want to exclude the other parts of my religious background. So anyway, Buddha was born over 2,500 years ago in India, and he lived in the northwestern part of India, and his father was a prince of a district, which was the same thing as a king. He was the highest office there. And very, very wealthy, and they lived in a large compound that his father kept in pristine condition. His family never had to face illness. Anytime his servant would become ill or would break something or whatever, they were sent to another location. When the family wanted to go for a walk in the gardens, they would always have a servant going out and would pick any dead leaves off of the trees or whatever, so they never had to face decay or any of that. Well, the Buddha lived in this sort of environment. And by the way, this is an interesting story that you might find a similarity in some of the children in some of the Chicago suburbs like Hinsdale. They were 25 years old and they were very, very protected. And when he was about 25, 26, he snuck off into the town for the first time with his buddy, who was a servant there. He was a chariot driver. And he saw, first of all, he saw someone who was very, very ill, who was a beggar and had sores all over the body. He saw a very old person that had a cane, could barely walk. And he saw a corpse. They had a funeral thing, and they had an open casket, and he'd never seen these sort of things. And then he saw somebody who's dressed up in monk's clothes, and he asked his buddy, he said, what was this? And he said, this is a person who had devoted his life trying to come to grips with, the ills of the world. So the Buddha went back to his compound, and this really shook him up, and he couldn't live there anymore, so he left his family and went out to try to find the answer to the universe. Tried a lot of the different religions, didn't take. His last one was ascetics, and they had a very strict code of living, and one of them was they barely ate. So he got down, and the story goes, I don't think this is true, but you could look at the Buddha and see his backbone through his stomach. So none of this worked, and he finally sat down beneath a tree and said, I'm going to sit here until I figure this whole thing out. And so he kind of went through his experiences of suffering in his life and death and all that, and he became enlightened. And I'll explain later exactly what that means. Then he spent about 45 years going around and teaching, which is a real plus compared to some other religions, in that there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of his teaching that has come down that we can refer to now. So that's the story of the Buddha. Now, when Buddhism in India went to the Southeast Asia countries like Cambodia, Burma, Vietnam, that was called Mahayana Buddhism, or excuse me, either Hinayana or Theravada Buddhism. And that's kind of my background. As it moved up to other northern countries such as Japan, China, Korea, it adjusted to their present religions and adjusted to their community and became Mahayana Buddhism. Then when it moved to Tibet, it became Tibetan Buddhism. Each of these had a core understanding of Buddhism, but the outside look was very, very different. Now it's moving to the West, to the United States, Australia, and the continent, and it's taking on a different form. And if later on we can talk about the differences, but I don't think right now that's that important. Now we get to the beliefs and dogma. There really isn't any, in the sense that you don't have to believe anything, you don't have to follow anything. First of all, you don't have to believe in a God, because Buddhism doesn't have a God. If the Buddha was very, very clear that he was not a God. He didn't even consider himself a holy man. He considered himself a healer. In the early 1950s, Daisetsu Suzuki came from Japan. He was a Japanese monk. And he opened up the first Buddhist center in the United States. And he was giving a talk in New York, and they had a large audience. And he started to explain Buddhism, and it was, at the end of it, he had a question and answer. And this Catholic priest stood up and said, I don't understand. Where's the religion? Where's the dogma? Where are the beliefs? And Suzuki said, no dogma, no beliefs, we dance. And that's, I think, a fairly good metaphor, is that you're kind of adjusting yourself. You don't step on your partner's feet, and you're just dancing to the community, to the music of the world. But there are some teachings that which I'll be talking about, but they aren't teachings to believe in. That they're teachings to look at closely and to test out for yourself. The Buddha kept saying, he said, come and verify. And you see the present teachers such as the Dalai Lama or Thich Nhat Hanh they're continually saying, keep your own religion, but just consider this and test it out. So some of the things I'll be saying aren't to be accepted blindly, and I'll explain later exactly what the Buddha said about it. The first teaching he gave was called the Four Noble Truths, or the Four Realizations. And the first one is that there's suffering in the world. There's suffering in our lives. The word that's translated as suffering is dukkha. It has slightly different meaning than just what we think of as suffering. It does consider the extreme mental and physical suffering that we all face. But it also has very subtle differences. It can cover stress. It can cover anxiety, dissatisfaction. The best definition for me is unease. If you think of when you're at ease, it doesn't have to be the passive kind of unease that you're at looking at a sunset or holding a baby. It can be something that when you're arguing with a clerk at DMV or you're dealing with returning some merchandise in a store. It's keeping that okayness that's very important. So dukkha, wide range, and very important in Buddhism to face it and to transform it by going through it as opposed to trying to ignore it. The second realization, the second truth, is that the cause of our suffering, of dukkha, is our reaction to events. It's not found in the events themselves. And this is very, very important and very hard I think, to really grasp. Something bad happens, someone dies that you know, and you think you have to suffer. It's part of the event. And that's not true. And if you really looked at it, you'll find that your reaction might change over a period of time. Your reaction, you might go to a counselor, and all of a sudden that reaction changes. There's I'm trying to think of his name. I think I've written it down here. A book called, one thing getting older, my memory has changed a little bit. Anyway, it was written by a Jewish Jew during the time of the Nazi regime in Germany, and he was put in a concentration camp. And the name of the book is Search for Meaning. And Viktor Frankl, yes, I can never remember that. And he was stripped of everything. His family was killed, and his identity was taken away. All of his what he was doing as a psychiatrist was taken away. His clothes was taken away. His identity, his health was taken. And he has one line in the book. He says that they could take everything away except my possibility of my reacting to things positively. They couldn't take away my decision to be happy. And I think of that sometimes when I have these minor things that happen to me. I said, if he can and take that sort of attitude, I certainly can too. So the third truth is that we don't have to react that way. We can react differently. So there's hope. And then the fourth truth, fourth realization is called the Eightfold Path. And that's 8 components of the path toward reaching that goal of peace and happiness and that okayness with events. Those 8 are divided into 3 categories. And the first category is ethical living. And that's the normal sort of things that I think every religion has. Don't cheat, don't lie, don't take other people's lives, don't misuse alcohol, don't misuse sexual energy. And again, those are the sort of things that aren't no one's judging you from high in Buddhism. That is something that you realize yourself. I've explained it to a friend of mine, and he says, well, I don't understand because someone who's very rich and has gotten there through ill means might be very happy. Well, you don't really know, and I think everyone has to judge for themselves. When you steal, or when you lie to somebody, or whenever, you have to look within yourself and see if that is hurting you. And Buddhism says it does hurt you. So that's those kind of rules that can kind of carry us forward. The second category is living a life of wisdom. And what that means is do no harm to yourself and others. And also keep an investigative attitude so that you recognize when you're harming yourself and you're harming others. The Buddha had a teaching where he was teaching his 12-year-old son. And he says, okay, before you do something, ask yourself if you're going to hurt yourself and others. And if the answer is yes, don't do it. During a activity, ask yourself the same questions and stop if there's any harm involved. And third, afterwards, ask yourself, did I get in a situation where I was harming myself and others? And just stop. So that's one, and that's the second category. Third category is mental development, mental training, is you can train yourself on these things, which is really meditation. And a lot of people have a wrong idea of meditation. One kind of meditation is the calming kind of meditation, is you're placing your attention on a mantra, a word or two, or you're placing it on your breath. Or you're placing it on an object, and you keep bringing your attention back to that, and everything just kind of calms down. And what you're doing is you're getting more and more acquainted with that peacefulness, and it changes your brain. There's been studies where they've put people through a 8-week course where they learn how to meditate, and they meditate every day, and they've taken functional MRIs of the brain, which shows what's happening in the brain and how it's composed before and after. And they found after it changed. It used to be that doctors and scientists thought that the brain size and shape was constant. Well, now it's called neuroplasticity, and things change. And what they found is the part that's associated with calmness and compassion gets larger after just 8 weeks of meditation, and the part that has to do with stress and tension gets smaller. Then there's meditations where you're concentrating on, for instance, loving kindness and compassion, and that period where you're meditating, hopefully every day, bleeds out into the rest of your life. There's meditation, one of types called Vipassana meditation, where you're really working at changing the way you experience and react to things that come up in your mind. And so you're training yourself to react differently. Woo. Now I was going to get into the 4 questions. The first question is, what would I do differently in my life? And I kind of have problems with the question in the following way. We can learn a lot, I think, about past mistakes, but most of the time it's kind of worthless to go back and look at different paths our lives can take. I think the book says, use the example of someone who's a doctor, and he's looking back, says, maybe I should be doing something different. Buddha was very practical. He kept saying, look at right now. Look at what's affecting you right now and how you can live right now better. If that has anything to do with that, or it doesn't have anything to do with it, just kind of ignore it. And there's a teaching story where he told of a man who stumbled into his village with a poisoned arrow in his back. And he collapsed in the town square, and a bunch of people gathered around him. And some people in the crowd, one person said, "Boy, that arrow was made well. I wonder if what kind of craftsman he was, what tribe he was from, and how he learned to do this finely tuned arrow." And another one would say, "Well, this marksman, he must. I wonder how far away he was. I wonder how he learned to shoot an arrow." And another one said, "Well, I wonder what if this guy dies. I wonder what happens to his belongings, if they're going to be given to the community or not." And the Buddha said, what's important is to get the arrow out and to clean out the poison. And the metaphor for the arrow and the poison is all the things that act upon us negatively in our lives right now. And we have to work at that as opposed to going back in our minds to something that might not, that's interesting for us to do, but might not have anything to do with gaining us peace and happiness. And then there's another problem, that we don't know the effect of different decisions we've made. There's a story of a farmer who had a horse, and he had a teenage son, and to help him in the fields. And the community thought him a very rich man, because a lot of people didn't even have those. One time the horse ran away, and he didn't have a horse to help him in the fields. And the villagers came out and they said, "I'm really sorry for this. This is really going to hurt you, and you have all of my sympathy." And the farmer said, "Well, you might be right." 3 or 4 days later, the horse comes back, and following that horse was another horse. And so put him in the corral, and the people came around and said, "Hey, you're really lucky. You're in good shape now. You're now the richest person in the village." And the farmer said, "Yeah, you could be right." 4 or 5 days later, his son was trying to break this horse, which was a wild horse, and he was tossed off and broke his leg. And he couldn't work in the fields till his leg healed. And the community came around and said, "We're really sorry of the loss of your son's efforts here." And the farmer said, "Well, you might be right." A few days later, 2 soldiers came from the king and said, "We were looking for young men to work in the army, and we're taking all the teenagers and up to age like 22 and to put them in the army," which was going to do a battle that was coming up that had been endangered the son if he had gone. Well, they didn't take the son because of his broken leg. So the villagers came back and said, "Well, boy, you're really lucky here." Well, you could go on in this, but you never really know something that happened in the past, what effect it would have on you. So that was, what would I do differently? So Mike's going to ask me some questions now, or a question or reflection.
So one of the am I back on? Yeah. One of the statements in the book is that impermanence is the great lesson of life, and that's obviously very closely related to the story you just told. And yet there is, I think, sort of a basic human longing for some kind of permanence. So where does, and maybe even in a healthy way, so where does that sense, does the counteracting force of permanence fit in with that emphasis on accepting the impermanence of things?
It doesn't. One of the things that you're working on in meditation, is that Vipassana meditation, is accepting whatever comes up. And you notice that when you quiet down and you notice something will come up that might be very disturbing, well, it goes away very quickly. What surprises me is when I first started meditating many years ago, is like itches. You're sitting there not moving, and all of a sudden your nose itches. And you go crazy. I remember I was facing a retreat, and it was the first day. And it was, I've forgotten what it was, 10-day retreat or something like that. And the first day, the first morning, my nose started itching. I said, I can't, and all this story came up as, if I don't scratch it, it's going to get worse and worse, and I'm going to go crazy and all this. And what you learn is that something like an itch, really, if you just let it alone, what you learn to do, you learn to turn off the story, that's only 2 or 3 seconds and it goes away. So you learn how impermanent things that happen in your mind fall away. And then you learn in life that things change. Raising kids, for instance, we've all noticed how they change from being a toddler to 7 years old to, like our daughter is now 7, and then they turn into a teenager, and then finally to adults. And if you try to get attached to that, then it creates all sorts of problems. Let me go back a little bit. When I said the 4 realizations, the 4 noble truths, the second one was that all of our suffering is due to the way we react to things. A lot of explanations of that, what causes that, is they say desire. And that's kind of misleading. What the Buddhist word for desire is tanha, that desire was translated from. And tanha means several different things. One is that desire in itself doesn't hurt you. We all have desires to have food, to be healthy, to exercise, to be good people, to help people, to be compassionate, etc. It's when it turns into attachment. And attachment, the original Sanskrit word was upadana. And that's really the translation besides attachment could be entrapment. When it turns into you're holding something that it's going to change, and for instance on a child, or it could be a spouse, where you have a certain conception of what they should be because they were that way 10 years ago. Now they're very different and you don't accept that. That gets into trouble. In India, they used to catch monkeys by having a big jar and with a small mouth on the top of it. And they'd bury the jar so just the top, the neck would stick out, and they'd put fresh fruit in it. And the monkey would come along, and he would smell the fresh fruit, and he'd reach down to grab the monkey, or grab like a banana, and then try to get out. And he couldn't get his hand out, and he never figured out that all he had to do was let go. And so the hunters would come up, and unless you let go, he's going to be caught. So that has to do with change, is those instances where you don't let something go, and everything's going to change anyway. So you're going to have a lot of grief for yourself and others.
So this is kind of a question more about the introductory statements than about the first question, but is there a sense that the suffering you mentioned, the anxiety, the unease, is kind of morally neutral? I mean, I guess you'd say it, because in the West, certainly in Christianity, we think of suffering as itself a negative thing. But does the second truth, saying that suffering comes from the way we respond to situations, does that turn suffering in itself into something that's kind of morally neutral?
Yeah, in a subtle way. A very good question. What it does is say, we go through a lot of different, we have anger, we have all these sort of things that go through it. And we have to look at that and accept it. You have to kind of say, yeah, that's causing us suffering, there's all this sort of thing. And that part is neutral. But then we transform it into something that is not suffering, something there's kind of a meta-okayness to it. I had a grandmother who was very much of a Christian, and she went through, her husband died, and then she decided she wanted to die and all this. And throughout the whole thing, she just said, well, it's God's will. And it's that kind of meta acceptance of that's that I'm Buddhists believe in, and that state you have to. Is that?
Yeah.
It's a very subtle point, but
Okay, so if part of the goal is to shape the way we respond to various events of our lives, what should we be shooting for? What the next question is, how do I know the right thing to do?
Well, it's all contained in those Four Noble Truths, and I think it fits any religion. That there are certain rules that you kind of look at and say, yeah, this makes sense to us. And, like don't steal, don't kill, and all that. That's part of it. And in theology, a lot of times they'll call that the via positivia way, which is the positive way that you have certain guidelines to kind of follow. And the other part is called the via negativity way, where you're clearing yourself of all the negative drives that you have. So it's kind of those two that you're balancing. And I think someplace in the book it says just following rules is not enough. And so it's very important to have that second part. And the three things that are called defilements in Buddhism is called anger, greed, and delusion. And what it really is aversion to things, aversion to reality. And for instance, in any situation, there are things you can't change. You go outside now and it's snowing and it might be slick out, it's frozen and all that. And if you spend a lot of time complaining about that mentally, and you're kind of getting yourself into the state, that's kind of worthless because that's just reality. You can't change that reality. What you can change is driving slowly or doing something like that differently.
That's good.
Okay. The third question is, how do I know who to follow? Let me read you something about what the Buddha, one of his teachings. There's a community in northwest India called Kalamat. And it's a center of was at the center of several major trade routes. And they had all sorts of preachers coming through in the different caravans. And the Buddha was there, and he gave them his teaching. And someone stood up and said, we hear a lot of stuff from different preachers, and a lot of them doesn't agree with one or the other. Why should we believe you? And which is a very good question, I think. So, and he said the following, and we'll just quote him: "Come, Kalamas, do not believe what has been acquired by repeated hearing, nor upon tradition, nor upon rumor, nor upon scripture, nor upon surmise, nor upon axiom, nor upon spacious reasoning, nor upon bias toward a notion pondered over, nor upon another's seeming ability, nor upon the consideration, this monk is our teacher." He says you have to come and verify yourself. Then he goes on to say what is very important is what he called the wise men, is considered the wise men, and to also listen to them and then test them out. And if he was born later, I'm surely say that Jesus and Muhammad and etc. Were wise men, and to consider them and test them out for yourself. So it's not just willy-nilly do anything, believe anything you want, do anything you want. Instead, it's a pretty rigorous process if you really test everything that you believe. So that's what I wanted to say about that.
So if you're testing it and examining the teaching, somebody's teaching, and you want to find out whether it rings true, what's the basis for making that decision? It comes down to kind of like what promotes human peacefulness, what promotes well-being. But of course, that's not always really clear, right? I mean, a 18-year-old thinks in the world today thinks that the thing that promotes his or her peacefulness is playing video games 16 hours a day.
Right.
And yet that might not be the best thing for them in the long run. So how do you make that evaluation of what is actually beneficial?
Well, true that someone at 18 should follow some rules, and that could be given by their parents. We had some handouts. I don't know where they are, but okay. That I don't need them now, but when you leave, maybe you can pick them up, and it's called the precepts, and those are the kind of rules that can carry you through until you're far enough on the spiritual path to be able to discern things for yourself and test it out truly. So, and every religion, I think, has certain rules like that, which will get you over those complicated places. A lot of times it doesn't. I mean, the thing about lying, is sometimes lying is good. The whole thing about you were in Nazi Germany and you had some Jewish family that was hidden in the basement, and some Nazi soldiers came up and they would say, you have any Jews here? And of course you didn't. You would lie. So you have to work at trying to get to a point where you notice those things that are harming your ability to react appropriately. And that's that whole area about meditation, where you're working on training your mind to react appropriately to any situation. And those aren't covered by rules. That's beyond that, because rules just carry you a certain way. By the way, the back of those is a whole bunch of references you can go to learn about meditation and learn about Buddhism. Did that sort of answer?
Yeah. Somehow in the midst of your response, I don't remember the connection now, but it made me think about karma. So talk about karma. What is it and how does it function in the whole world of Buddhism?
What karma means is for every thing you do, there's a reaction. One way it can be interpreted is you don't get away with anything. Even the smallest thing you do has some sort of impact on you. It can be bad, if you leave here and a wallet's lying out in the outside and you pick it up and keep it, and even though someone's name in there, the reaction, if you really look at yourself, is going to be negative. It's going to impact you. The good thing about karma is that the positive things that you can do, even very minor things, have an impact on you. It's like going to the gym. You don't start off lifting a 250-pound weight. You start off with something small and build yourself up. And the same thing with using karma, as you start off very, very minor. Thich Nhat Hanh formed a meditation center in southern France called Plum Village. And there's several signs around there, and they say, every morning, perform an act that's going to bring peace and happiness to somebody. And every afternoon, perform an act that will alleviate someone's ill will or suffering. And you think of a retreat center, you don't have many options to, it's not like going downtown Chicago and everyone is in a peaceful mood, etc. So it's very, very minor things that you could do, even smiling at somebody, letting someone in front of you in a cafeteria line, or getting a cup of coffee or something. So that's really karma, and that's in one formulation, it has simply to do with your own suffering, and that you can work on acting appropriately to situations. very, very minor situations. And for a period of time, those acts will accumulate and it will help you alleviate suffering.
So, one way, it's almost like a cartoon presentation of karma, but it's kind of like there's I guess not divine, but sort of a cosmic a bookkeeper who keeps track of the good stuff you do and the bad stuff you do, and hopefully the good stuff outweighs the bad stuff, and so your karma is good. But it sounds more like what you're saying is that it's more almost the naturalistic results of those things. It's not like a magical spiritual bookkeeping. It's the naturalistic results of those things.
Right. It's like gravity. I mean, it's just a part of nature that your mind works that way.
So sociopaths are a big problem for Buddhism, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they're a big problem for all of us, of course, but if the natural process is off for whatever reason, that throws a monkey wrench in the whole thing.
Sort of. And one way I think about it is either you can do the Don Corleone of the Godfathers.
Yeah.
The last scene when he died, he was very happy playing with his child, and he had it would appear outwardly that even though he had a life of crime, that he was very happy. But the other is Tony Soprano, who was also very successful and very rich and all that, but was very tortured during the whole thing. Okay. What really is saying, look at yourself. Forget about anybody else. You don't know about sociopaths. You don't know all that stuff. You, looking at the things you do you notice when you do something that's going to harm you? Then in the future, you learn that, and you learn which ones are going to be that lead to peace and happiness.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. What's the other one now? What does it take to succeed?
Well, I kind of already covered it, is that you need that kind of that via positivia, which is the positive rules that you can follow and confirm for yourself. And the other was to clearing your mind. And there's some other things that, one is that spirituality, the path, is not something just Sunday morning, for instance. It has to be 24/7. And the Buddha was very adamant about that, is throughout your whole life. For instance, one of the realizations is your livelihood, is having you can't be a spiritual person with the wrong livelihood. You couldn't be someone working in a packing house, which I did for a time as a kid, killing cows. It has to invade your whole life, because these laws, these natural laws that are there, operate through your whole life. That's part of it. Another part is actuating peace and happiness and joy in your life. We go through a day, and a lot of times we don't pay attention to those moments which are wonderful. When we drove over here, we're driving through Hinsdale, and it's beautiful out. The trees covered with ice in it, and sometimes you don't realize that that's there. So you have to spend some time cultivating those peaceful, happy, joyful moments, and that's very important to do that all the time. It's not putting a positive spin on something that's not, that's bad. It's not positive thinking. What it's doing is just realizing and taking note of the beauty and the joyfulness in life. Same thing in meditation is you aren't going to meditate if you find it painful all the time. So you kind of look for that peacefulness that you'll find, that new way of looking at things. So that's very important. Let's see, what else? Taking your corrosive emotions, because anger can be very corrosive, and not replacing it by positive emotions. but fostering positive emotions, because if your mind is positive, you can't have negative emotions. I mean, it's either one or the other. There's a teaching called the Brahma Viharas, the Four Noble Mental States. And they are compassion, loving kindness, sympathetic joy, that's taking joy in someone else's success, and equanimity. And there's meditations for each one of those, where you can work on developing those. And so instead of having anger, it might be that compassion might come up instead.
So let me ask you another question. I think it kind of goes back to the story about the guy and the horses running away and the horses coming back and his son falling off the horse and the soldiers coming and him not getting drafted. And several things that she wrote in the book obviously highlighted that acceptance of the way things are, controlling our response to things, is very important. And I don't know, maybe it's just my Western upbringing, like shining through, but it all can sound kind of passive. Like you accept the way things are, which made me think of, the story that, I don't know, probably all of you have heard in sermons in Union Church, and that is that if you live downstream in a community and a body comes floating down the river, somebody's been stabbed or shot or whatever, you feel really bad. It's terrible. It's awful. There's mourning. There's grieving. This is terrible. But that's about all you can do. And then next week another body comes floating down the river, and you're like, wow, this is bad. What's happening here? And the next week another body comes floating down the river. And you could accept, okay, well, bodies are floating down the river. That's the way things are. But of course, the next step is to go upriver and find out what in the world is causing this and making it stop. So where's that kind of active engagement for the well-being of the world?
One of the things I tried to make evident, maybe I didn't do it that well, is that in any situation there's things you can't change. And it kind of reduces down to the serenity prayer, give me the strength to accept what I can't change, and the ability to change what I can. It is very surprising to me, both myself and seeing others, is how much time we spend thinking about what we can't change. Yeah. That's the reality. And that gets into, distorts what we can change. A relative borrows $500 from you, okay, did it 3 or 4 years ago. And all your efforts to get the money back has not been successful. So, what is the reality there? The reality is that he borrowed $500 and you can't get the money back, right? You can't change that. What you can change is what you're going to do next. You could accept it. You could bring a lawsuit or whatever you're going to do. It's very easy to get into the state where all you're doing is keeping your mental attention on those you can't change. So the bodies come down there. You're continually thinking on the negative stuff. That gets in the way of what you can do about it. So it's very important that the second half is there.
So the acceptance is to not dwell on the horrible reality that there are bodies flowing down the river and be overcome by that grief or that lack of peacefulness, and therefore have the energy to go do something about it.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Let me talk a little bit about the kind of the end game of this, because that's very important, and we can learn from those people that are enlightened, that are mystics. And let me explain it this way. During the last 5 or 10 years, some major universities have started programs to do research and to offer degree programs on things called contemplative science or highest consciousness science or whatever. And Yale, Harvard, Brown have active programs. University of Wisconsin has been kind of a leader in this, has very active programs. U of Chicago has one. A year ago, I was pulled in for a day study of what I was doing, and they put things in my head and looking at my reactions to things. Taking one of the programs, the one at Harvard, there's a Jeffrey Martin, and he's written a lot, and he's in the, if you looked him up on the internet, he has a lot of studies that has been printed. And he has interviewed thousands and thousands of people that were someplace on the more advanced religious path. And he found that there's people that were called mystics or enlightened or God consciousness or Jesus consciousness or unity consciousness or whatever, all had common characteristics. Once you got beneath the story, there was very common. And if you've read many Christian mystics, for instance, or Persian mystics, they seem to be pointing toward the same thing, even using different words. And he found, first of all, he said, those people have a very different sense of identity, that they changed their idea of themselves. The whole thing about which we all do is struggle against reality, that we are contained within our body and the rest of the world is outside. They had a very different sense of that. There's a Persian poet, Kabir, who had a very eloquent, had the following thought in it. He says, a clay pot with some water in it just floating on a pond. With a touch of the truth, the pot shatters and the water within and the water without becomes the same. There's also a very different sense of agency in these people, that they have a sense of something else operating through them. One of my favorite expressions of this is a Christian mystic, Hildegard of Bingen, and she says it's like the feeling of being a feather on the breath of God. So you're just floating around. There's a great poster of a Buddhist on a surfboard, surfing the waves. And it's that sense, of surfing through life instead of having to fight it. The third is people's thoughts, that we have those people that advance, those enlightened people, have very few thoughts. That there's been a study that an average person in our age has 50 to 80,000 thoughts a day, and only 5% or so are useful. The rest of them is just regurgitating old stuff and just junk stuff. And
anybody attest to that? Yeah.
Yeah. And so, and these mystics don't have those. They just deal with the situation as it comes up. And there's part of the brain that has to do with it. It's called, the scientists, a lousy name, it's called default mode network. And it shows when you're actively dealing with the situation in front of you, as opposed to daydreaming or something like that. And these advanced meditators, they can look at their brain and see that is much more developed. And then the fourth category was the emotions, is they had little negative emotions, if any. And it might come up, they might get angry. But it goes away right away. It doesn't harm them. They have that meta-okayness with them. It doesn't bother them. And I think those categories define enlightenment, and it also defines a goal for us, is to try to live by.
So enlightenment is not kind of like a cosmic mystical thing. It is can be fully realized in a life.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about this Jeffrey Martin is his study. He found enlightened people among all religions, plus agnostics and atheists. And he found them in any part of life. He found some that were captains of industry, that were heads of CEOs of major corporations. He found one that was ran a large government agency. He found janitors. He found teachers. He found doctors. So it's people that are living out in very productive lives. And then, of course, there's some that went off and lived in a cave someplace. So yeah, it's in any religion, and Buddhism is one of them. Sometimes it gets very. You know, what were these people thinking? I mean, the Buddha was very practical, but some of the teachings have come to the myths that come down through the ages. You know, their astral travel and all this stuff, and that's nothing to do really with Buddhism. It's something else. So enlightenment is a very practical, something that can be attained by people. But you know, the Dalai Lama said, if you're every year, if you're a little bit more compassionate and a little bit more comfortable in your skin, you're making major progress in your life.
Does that apply to any kind of sense of reincarnation? Does that continue over from Hinduism into Buddhism?
Every religion seems to have a want among the people to deal with death. You know, they don't want us. It's not going to end. There's a bunch of people in Buddhism. That's a big thing that they talk about is rebirth. The Buddha, when asked that, a lot of times just wouldn't answer. He just said, that's one of these questions that we just don't deal with.
Good answer.
He said, only thing I teach is suffering and alleviation of suffering. He gave a good answer one time. He said, okay, if there's rebirth, if there's some sort of life after death, our job is to live our present life the best way we possibly can. If there's not life after death, our job is to live this present life the best way we can. So why waste time talking about it and arguing about it? But it's a great thing to talk about, you know, one of these fun things.
Okay, what about questions from all of you? I think I have a microphone that I want you to talk into.
Got someone right here?
WMIC4, Penny?
Don't give it to my wife.
Let's see. Oh, good, it is on. Hold it right up close to your mouth.
Okay. For about the last 10 years, I've been hearing about socially engaged Buddhism. And
Yes.
is that just a branch in sort of in Western civilization?
Yes.
Yeah. Because then there's like Zen Buddhism is more like the Unitarian version, it's a very simplified version of Buddhism. I mean, that seems to be what's most popular in this country, right? Zen Buddhism? No?
Actually, Theravada is more, but it's see, one of the advantages, the change from as Buddhism moved from all these countries over here, is if you go to Southeast Asia, you really only have one kind of Buddhism, and they don't even know about the other ones. If you go to Japan, you'll have Zen Buddhism. They really don't know about other kinds. Here, we're exposed to all different kinds, so it's kind of taking the best of all of them. Social Buddhism is very important. There's interesting.
So define what that is. What'd you call it? Socially engaged Buddhism. What's that?
To give you an example, there's a Buddhist teacher, Bernie Glassman, and he's written several books, and good Jewish name. He's still a Jew and he's a Buddhist that runs retreats in New York City. And instead of going to a quiet place and staying out of the out where it's quiet and meditating and all that. He has it out in the streets, and they live with the homeless people, and they learn their problems, and they sleep out in the streets and all that. Buddhism is just being very involved in justice and righting wrongs in society, which is very important to.
Okay, what else? Maybe make this a little louder, Penny.
Can you define natural law? Does it have a definition?
No, I mean it's whatever you try to avoid that, because what you have to do is you hear these things and you have to test them out for yourself. Like if I say that killing is not a good thing, instead of taking it as a natural law, which it is, you have to really look at yourself and how you feel killing a mouse or killing a whatever. And then you discover those things that are natural laws for yourself. Does that help a little? It's
sort of, but I keep going back to what Mike said before about what if something inside you says not too much is wrong.
Well, like I was trying to say, is that there's certain rules that every religion has, and you have to discover them for yourself. But for a period of time, until you get the maturity, you're far enough on the spiritual path to really observe in yourself what is wrong, you just kind of accept them. So it's not blind faith in these things. It's provisional faith. You're looking and say, okay, this religion says you shouldn't steal. Okay, I'm going to accept that, but I'm going to be testing it as I go along the path.
Sounds kind of similar to the way that the Protestant reformers used to think about the law of the Old Testament, because of course Christian teaching has been that in the life of Christ we see the fulfillment of the law. But then, okay, the question is like, okay, well, what's the purpose of the Ten Commandments then? Or what's the purpose of the rest of the ethical law in the Old Testament? And the traditional answer has been that the law is a babysitter until you discover the fullness of morality in Christ. And it's going to take a while, before that happens in your life, but the law is there as a structure and as a framework until you see the fullness of morality in Christ. Sounds like you're talking about the same sort of thing.
You said it much better.
It was written for Judaism.
And it was written for Judaism, right?
Jesus was a Jew.
Absolutely. Certainly was.
The New Testament is the laws for the Jew.
Yeah, right.
One of the things I learned fairly recently, I was reading a theological book by a Christian, and he said that faith only recently has meant just holding a bunch of beliefs. Before that, it was based on experience. And he was saying that the translation of faith way back when, it was from the word metanoia, I hope I pronounced that right, which means transformation of the heart. You had to go through that transformation of the heart, which is faith, as opposed to just mouthing a bunch of words.
You just stole my sermon a week from Sunday. It's like, or previewed, I should say. Yes, it's
You'll say it much better.
What real faith actually is. That's right.
Much better and much longer.
All right. So what else? Yes, Christy.
So at some point in your life, if you said you've been Buddhist for 42 years, you chose to move to Buddhism.
Yeah.
When and why?
When I grew up in a Lutheran church, and what I'm going to say is only for that particular church at that time. It doesn't have anything to do with any other church. And what I thought was, it was secular. I mean, all they talked, it was a big thing about there's getting money for a new church organ. And that was in every sermon. And it wasn't leading to that feeling of spirituality, which I wanted a lot. Okay, that was a big part of it, and it was also the time of where civil rights was a big thing, and the churches weren't really leading that. They were fighting it in some cases. So that kind of turned me off. One of the things I really liked about when I was exposed to Buddhism is this come and see, come and verify for yourself. Don't accept anything just because you're born into it. Because I'd ask somebody, why were you a Christian? And they'd say, well, all these reasons. I say, okay, how many Christians do you think were born into Christianity? And that has to be 98% or something. And so they accept it, nothing wrong with it. Because it's not, I have nothing bad about Christianity at all. But that whole idea of my trying to accept all these creeds, just based that I was born into it, kind of turned me off. I remember being confirmed, I had to learn the Nicene and the Apostles' Creed, and I kept asking the teacher then, I said, well, what does this mean? And they were just saying, just learn the damn thing. It's a mystery was the other thing. And so that's why. And there's also another reason that when I was in high school, I learned some of this stuff, and I could pick up girls because it made me sound exotic.
There you go. That was, let me see, what decade? Maybe the 60s, maybe?
Yeah, well.
Yes, Melissa. Loudly.
Do you have organized weekly worship? Do you have a place you go to? Do you have a priest or tell me about your worship.
We don't worship.
Really?
Yes. What would we worship to?
There's no God, there's no divine, except that which exists, in us, I guess you might say.
What we do, we have a group in Downers Grove, which we've been meeting 22 years, and I helped we meet only twice a month, and we go there, and we meditate, and we talk over the sort of things that we're talking over now. But there's never... In some countries, the whole devotional side of it is very strong. But it's not in the original Buddhism. It is not something so much that's in Western Buddhism.
And then the people that you were talking about, the enlightened people that don't have all these random thoughts that the regular people have, is that because they're spiritually deeper, farther down the path, they're praying more? How do you explain that they don't have all the random thoughts?
Jeffrey Martin found, well, first of all, praying, because you have atheists and you have agnostic, and Buddhism, which don't try to pray, found that some people just woke up in the morning, very few of them, without any background at all, and were suddenly enlightened, which create a real problem because all of a sudden their sense of self changed. They didn't understand it, and so they would go to a psychologist or a counselor who didn't understand it either, and they thought they were crazy until they finally had a framework they could put it into. They found some people had a very extensive background of meditation or contemplation, whatever religion they are. Some of them had only a year. So it kind of, and they don't know why that somebody.
Those of you who grew up in a conservative Christian environment will understand this question. Is there such a thing as enlightenment backsliding? I mean, can you be enlightened and lose it?
Well, yeah, you could, but it's not likely. We're really talking about transformation. It's not something belief-driven. So you lose your belief in something that you don't have any evidence for. I mean, you're transformed. Right. What happens sometimes is backsliding in the following way. What Martin described was a a spectrum of these enlightened people. At the far end, these people didn't have emotions, and they were very effective in whatever they're doing, but they were pretty on the extreme. And some of them decided they didn't want to live that way, so they kind of moved off of it to. They did have emotions. I'm just picking one of the many things that they could kind of deliberately go back, still be enlightened, still, but they would not. They would have emotions like anger, but they wouldn't be bothered by it.
Okay.
But they wouldn't go back to just being,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The Catholics have the Pope. I always thought that the Buddhists had the Dalai Lama, who kind of reigned in the same. No.
He does
Good
that
question.
for Tibetan Buddhism, but Tibetan Buddhism is a very small part of Buddhist, and so he doesn't. I mean, he's respected a lot by all sorts of Buddhists, and hopefully by Catholics and Jews and all that, but. He doesn't.
I find that relationship that.
He doesn't. He's not considered. He's not the Pope of Buddhism. No, there's really nobody that leads that.
But he is a world leader as far as lots of countries consider him to be a world and invite him for all kinds of consultations and.
Yeah, I mean he's a very respected person, but he's not he can't speak for all of religion.
Plain respect. No.
Yeah.
Well, he's leader of a country too. I mean, of Tibetan Buddhism, rather. Right.
Is he the secular leader of Tibet? Well, as much as the Chinese will allow him to be.
Yeah.
The Chinese, of course, claim governance of Tibet.
Yeah.
Okay.
And see, one of the strengths, and you could also say the weaknesses of Buddhism, is it went from country to country. It did form some very different outside, as you look at it, it could be very different. And so someone who's a very good teacher in one area of Buddhism might not be accepted by another area of Buddhism.
Okay.
Confused by what you're saying, and when I think of the Dalai Lama, it didn't fit.
Yeah. Within one version, he's the most well-respected figure, but that's just one version.
He has quite a problem because they consider him, a lot of us consider him as a god, and he keeps going again and again. He says, "I'm not a god. I'm just an ordinary priest or ordinary monk," and but he's very respected. So.
That's good.
What's the role of a monk or a Buddhist temple?
Very interesting question. As Buddhism has moved to different parts to the West, primarily, for the most part, they've formed as cultural centers. You've got one very close here in Willowbrook, the one down called the Buddha Dharma Center. I've given some talks there. A lot of what they do is as a community center for Thais, and they will have. It's very interesting because, and this is true in a lot of different kinds of Buddhism. They come over here and they have their cultural way of doing things, their cultural foods and all that. They don't meditate. They don't go on retreats. So the center, the Buddha Dharma Center, will have some retreat, like a weekend retreat or a 10-day retreat. None of the Thais will go to that. Then they'll have a big ceremony of different Buddhist holidays, and all the Thais will go to that, and the Westerners won't go to it. So it's primarily those they have two different functions. One is to host retreats and to give talks, and the other one's to be a cultural center.
So my son lived in China for a year, and while he was there, I went to visit him one time, and one of the things we did was go to I guess you'd call it a temple?
Could, different places call it.
And some sort of praying to ancestors for blessing was like the common cultural practice in that temple. Is that tied to Buddhism, or is that?
a friend of mine, Will, he died not too long ago. He was a Catholic deacon, and he went to Japan, and he went to all these things, and he went to a Japanese temple, and he saw a ceremony there, and they couldn't go in, but they could see it from a distance, and the priest walked up and down the aisles, and he had a big feather, and he'd dip it in the water and bless everyone. He says, that's exactly the same thing we do back in our Catholic place. So it's very interesting that if you look at the history of religions, of almost any organized religions, they change through the years. And there seems to be a need for consoling, is how do you deal with deaths? And so you come up with these stories, which is not original Buddhism and might not be in a lot of other religions. It changes. Some sociologists I've read said that all organized religions start spiritually, they end up culturally. A bunch of nice people getting together and talk about nice things. And the spiritual, that was my experience when I was a kid in the church. So, nice people getting together. Let me say it a different way. In Thailand, there are a bunch of centers. They're called city centers, city Buddhist centers. And there is very similar to what you see, you're talking about. The duties of the people that go there are one is to support the center and the monks, and two, to be good citizens, and third is to show up to some of these ceremonies. They have forest monasteries out in the boonies, which are very, very different. They're looking at trying to transform people, and it's very strict. And a lot of meditations, a lot of times they'll be meditating 8 to 14 hours a day. And they have some rules. For some reason, I don't know why, but you can't have solid food after noon. And the living conditions are very stark, yes. And so, and there's quite a tension between the two. That there was one kind of famous of the forest monasteries, and he was always railing against the city monasteries, because in city monasteries you could go to and have the priest bless your lottery numbers, and for money, of course. And,
of course.
And he just said that's the most silliest thing I ever saw. And that's
People will be people.
People will be people. Yeah.
That's right. Okay, I'm sorry. I have to interrupt you. It's 10 till. He said that he wanted to close with a time of guided meditation, and so I want to allow him to do that. Feel free to save your questions and hold him a few minutes after 8 on your own. And might I suggest that you stand up for a moment, just to make sure this guided meditation doesn't turn into guided drowsiness. So spin in a circle.
And stretch.
And stretch. All right. In 45 minutes you can be home in bed, but this is a little more, I don't know, maybe it's not. I should stop talking and let him explain. So there you go.
Okay. What we're going to do is a loving kindness meditation. It's called Metta, M-E-T-T-A. And it was developed by the Buddha 2,500 years ago, and it's been used with millions and millions of people. And usually I start off with a forgiveness meditation, but since of time restraints, I won't do that. But I'll just give you an idea of what we would do. Is get real quiet, and then I would say everybody in their own mind, for all those who have harmed me, either consciously or unconsciously, I forgive them. And we'd say that 3 times. And then would say, I'd say, for all those I have harmed, either consciously or unconsciously, may they forgive me. And we'd say that 3 times. And then it would be, for all those times that I've harmed myself, either consciously or unconsciously, I forgive myself. And the last one, a lot of times it's very difficult for people, and I've had people's tears running down. It's the whole thing about forgiving themselves. But anyway, so we'll go on to the loving kindness and meditation. So if you get kind of comfortable, and if you can get the posture where your back's relatively straight, and it's just close your eyes And just become aware of your breath for a couple of breaths. And just as it goes in and out, just trying to leave everything behind. Now, think of someone that you have an uncomplicated feeling of loving kindness for. Could be a relative. Could be someone that's not even alive anymore. Could be a pet. Could be just a situation. You can imagine yourself playing with a puppy or holding a newborn child. And just get in touch with that feeling of loving kindness. Just trying to feel it with your heart. And I want to use some words, and this is not a prayer word. It is just trying to get you to connect to that feeling of loving kindness. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. Just the best you can, just turn off your mind, just feel. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. Now expand that feeling of loving kindness to other people that you love. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. And if your mind starts going crazy, just go back and connect with that feeling of loving kindness that you had at the start. Bring it forward to those others that you love. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. Now expand that feeling of loving kindness to yourself. May I be happy. May I be at peace. May I be free of suffering. If you have any resistance, just note the resistance and going back to that feeling of loving kindness. May I be happy. May I be at peace. May I be free of suffering. Now expand that feeling of loving kindness to acquaintances, people you come in contact with, and include the people in this room. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. Now expand that feeling of loving kindness to those people you have a problem with. They might be people that you know, they might be people you read about, they might be people that have different views, different color, different religion. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. If they're causing trouble to you, if they were at peace and happy and free of suffering, they probably wouldn't be a problem to you. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. If you lose that feeling of loving kindness, go back and get in touch with it again and bring it forward. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. Now, the best you can, applying to all living beings. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. To people in hospitals or seriously ill and their caregivers, may they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. And to those in war-torn areas of the world, including those in the United States, may they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. Just meeting all the injustices and all the ills and all the suffering in the world. Just meeting it with an open heart and with a feeling of loving kindness. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. Facing the world with an open heart, no barriers between ourselves and them. May they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. And think of instances of your own. And just silently think of them, and may they be happy. May they be at peace. May they be free of suffering. Now go back to that original person or object that you used to get in touch with that feeling of loving kindness. And really get in touch with that feeling again. And then If you can, just drop that object and just get into the pure feeling of loving kindness. And see the joy there, the peacefulness. Just feel that joy, feel that happiness, feel that peacefulness. You might be in a bad situation now. You could have been last week, you could be next week. But right now, just feel that joy, that happiness, that peace. May we all be happy. May we all be at peace. May we all be free of suffering. Peace, happiness, joy. And very gently come back to the room and open your eyes. What was your experience? Anybody?
It was peaceful. It was good.
Good. Okay.
You did a wonderful job leading us.
Oh, thank you.
Expanding the realm to all living things is itself a powerful experience. We don't often do that.
And we don't do it to people we have problems with very often. So, yeah.
But yeah, in a sympathetic way, we kind of like, oh, God be gracious to them. I mean, as Christians, oh, God be gracious to them too.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't like accept all of it.
Well, as you go home and drive and just notice the happiness and joy in the surroundings. And the present moment is usually pretty peaceful, even in some awful situations. So, go in peace.
Thank you.